Imagine strapping yourself into a rocket on wheels, hurtling down a track at over 200 miles per hour, with nothing but a thin sheet of metal between you and certain death. Welcome to Formula One racing in the 1970s. In those days, stepping into a Formula One car was like playing Russian roulette with your life. These were literal death traps, but what made this era so perilous? And how did we go from losing 12 drivers in a single decade to creating one of the safest motorsports in the world? Let's find out. In the early 1970s, a time Formula One was experiencing a technological revolution. Gone were the days of simple, sturdy cars racing on converted airfields. The sport had evolved into a high-stakes battle of engineering prowess, with teams pushing the boundaries of what was possible, often at the expense of driver safety. To understand just how dangerous Formula One has become, let's look at some of the shocking statistics. In the entire decade of the 1970s, 12 drivers lost their lives on the track. That's more than one death per year. To put that into perspective, in the last 30 years, we've thankfully only had 3 fatalities in Formula One. The difference is staggering. What made these cars so lethal? The answer lies in several key factors. First, their lightweight construction played a significant role. Take the Lotus 72, for instance, which Jochen Rindt drove to victory in the 1970 World Championship. This car weighed just 540 kilograms when fully fueled, whereas today's Formula One cars weigh at least 798 kilograms. This ultra-light design meant that in the event of a crash, there was minimal material to absorb the impact. Second, many of these vehicles were built using highly flammable materials. Components were often made from magnesium, a metal that, while light, is notoriously prone to catching fire. Consequently, a crash didn't result in a broken car. It frequently led to devastating fires. Third, the design left drivers exposed. Without a survival cell, drivers were surrounded by fuel tanks and sat with their legs in front of the front axle. The consequences of a frontal impact are often severe, placing the drivers at great risk. Finally, the lack of safety equipment was a grave concern. It wasn't until 1975 that fireproof suits became mandatory. Prior to this, drivers wore regular fabric overalls, offering no protection from the constant danger of fire. To fully understand the peril of this era, it's essential to examine some of the most shocking incidents that occurred. One of the most horrific incidents occurred at the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix. Roger Williamson, in his only second F1 race, suffered a tire failure at high speed. His car flipped and caught fire, trapping him inside. Fellow driver David Purley stopped and desperately tried to save Williamson, attempting to flip the burning car and extinguish the flames. But with inadequate firefighting equipment and marshals unable to help due to the lack of fireproofing clothing, Purley could only watch helplessly as Williamson perished. The race continued, with cars speeding past the Inferno for 8 agonizing minutes. However, perhaps the most famous car crash of the era was Niki Lauda's fiery accident at the Nürburgring in 1976. Lauda, already a world champion, was battling James Hunt for the title when disaster struck. His Ferrari swerved off the track, hit an embankment, and burst into flames. Lauda was trapped in the Inferno for almost a minute before drivers managed to pull him out. The extent of Lauda's injuries was horrifying. He suffered severe burns to his head and inhaled toxic fumes that damaged his lungs. The last rites were administered in the hospital, but in an astonishing display of courage, Lauda returned to racing just 42 days later, still bandaged and in immense pain. Lauda's crash brought international attention to the dangers of Formula One. It highlighted the need for better barriers, improved fire safety, and more stringent safety checks on notoriously dangerous tracks like the Nürburgring. But what made these cars so blindly fast and dangerous in the first place? The answer lies in the rapid advancement of technology, particularly in the field of aerodynamics. The 1970s saw a revolution in car design, led by innovative engineers like Colin Chaplin of Lotus. In 1968, Chapman introduced wings to Formula One, dramatically increasing downforce and cornering speeds. By the early 70s, ground effect aerodynamics were squeezing the cars to the track like never before, allowing for mind-bending cornering speeds. While these advancements made cars faster, safety measures lagged far behind. The circuits, many decades old, were not designed to handle these new speeds. Barriers were often inadequate, runoff areas were minimal or non-existent, and medical facilities at many tracks were woefully unprepared for high-speed accidents that were becoming more common. As the death toll mounted, voices calling for change grew louder. One of the most prominent was that of three-time world champion Jackie Stewart. Stewart had personally lost 57 colleagues to racing accidents, became a tireless advocate for improved safety measures. In those days, if you raced for 5 years, there was a 2 out of 3 chance you'd die, Stewart recalled. And his crusade for safety earned him the nickname Nanny Stewart for some who felt he was overreacting. But time would prove him right. Stewart championed a range of crucial safety improvements that have since become standard but were not always in place. Among his significant contributions for advocating for mandatory seatbelts were not required until 1972. He also pushed for using full-face helmets, emphasizing their importance for driver safety. Despite these efforts, progress was slow. Many in the sport, including some drivers, saw the dangers as an inherent part of Formula One's appeal. Enzo Ferrari famously said, "Racing is a great mania, to which one must sacrifice everything, without reticence, without hesitation." This attitude was reflected in the circuit designs of the era. Take the old Nürburgring, for instance, known as the Green Hell. This 14-mile circuit twisted through the Eifel Mountains with over 170 corners, many blind, with virtually no runoff areas. Trees lined much of the track, and fog could roll in at any moment. It was a driver's nightmare and a stark example of how ill-equipped many circuits were for the increasingly fast cars. The 1976 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, where Lauda had his horrific crash, was a turning point. After the accident, Lauda said, "The Nürburgring is the best track in the world. Greasy as it is, it's still the best. But in Formula One today, it's just not on anymore." The next year, the German Grand Prix was moved to a much safer Hockenheimring, signaling a shift in priorities. Gradually, the dangerous circuits were either modified or dropped from the calendar entirely. But it wasn't just the tracks that needed changing. The cars themselves were evolving in ways that prioritized speed over safety. The introduction of ground effect aerodynamics in the late 70s made cars faster than ever, but also more unpredictable and dangerous. The Lotus 79, introduced in 1978, was the first car to fully exploit the ground effect, using the shape of its underbody to create a low-pressure area, essentially sucking the car to the track. This allowed for incredible cornering speeds. But if the seal between the car and the track was broken, say by running over a curb, the car could suddenly lose all downward force and become uncontrollable. The ground effect era brought with it a new set of dangers. Drivers were subjected to extreme G-forces, and the stiff suspension required for ground effect to work properly made the cars punishing to drive. One of the most tragic examples of this came in 1978 at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Lotus driver Ronnie Peterson, known as the Super Suede, was involved in a multi-car pileup at the start of the race. His Lotus 78 hit the barriers and burst into flames. Fellow drivers James Hunt, Clay Regazzoni, and Patrick Depailler managed to pull Peterson from the wreckage, but the damage was done. Peterson died the next day from complications arising from his injuries. But after this, Professor Sid Watkins, a neurosurgeon, would revolutionize trackside medical care in Formula One. Bernie Ecclestone, who had recently taken control of the sport's commercial rights, brought Watkins on board in 1978 to improve medical standards. Watkins' impact was immediate and profound. He insisted on having a medical car follow the field on the first lap of each race, a practice that continues to this day. He pushed for better equipped medical centers to each circuit and standardized emergency procedures. But even with these improvements, the sport was still grappling with the fundamental issue. The cars were simply too fast for the tracks they were racing on. The ground effect era had pushed cornering speeds to new heights, and the circuits were struggling to keep up. As the 1970s drew to a close, it was clear that major changes were needed. The FIA, then the FISA, began to take a more active role in regulating car design and track safety. In 1981, they mandated a minimum ground clearance for cars in an attempt to limit ground effect. This was the beginning of a push and pull between engineers seeking performance and regulators trying to keep speeds in check, a battle that continues to this day. As we moved into the 1980s, the lessons learned from the previous decade began to bear fruit. Safety became a primary concern, not an afterthought. But their journey was far from over. It would take another tragic weekend, the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, where we lost both Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna to truly revolutionize safety in Formula One. So what do you think? Are you glad Formula One has become safer? Or do you miss the raw danger of the past? Share your thoughts in the comment section and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.